In 2001, a man the tech press called bitter and paranoid said one sentence about Microsoft that the entire industry would spend the next 25 years proving true. And almost nobody noticed until it was already too late to do anything about it. So let me show you exactly what he saw coming, because once you see this pattern, you will never look at your own computer the same way again. This is not a story about hating a company. This is not nostalgia for open source purism or a grudge match between a Finnish programmer and a Seattle boardroom. This is a story about how power actually moves inside the technology you use every single day, how it gets acquired quietly, how it gets normalized slowly, and how by the time you notice it, the choice you thought you still had was gone months or years before you ever felt its absence. Rewind for a second, because to really understand why Linus reacted the way he did in 2001, you have to remember he had already watched this exact company operate once before, in a completely different arena, years earlier, when the browser wars of the 1990s ended with regulators in Washington ruling that Microsoft had illegally used its operating system monopoly to crush a competing browser simply by bundling its own version into every copy of Windows and making it nearly impossible to remove. That case dragged through the courts for years, ended in a landmark antitrust ruling, and taught an entire generation of engineers a lesson that never left Linus's mind. This was a company that did not compete by building a better product first and letting people choose it. It competed by controlling the layer beneath the product so thoroughly that choice itself quietly stopped existing. So when the Halloween documents surfaced just a few years later, describing the exact same playbook aimed at Linux instead of a rival browser, Linus was not reacting to something new. He was recognizing a pattern he'd already watched play out once in real time, with a paper trail and a courtroom verdict to prove it. In October of 2001, a set of internal Microsoft documents leaked onto the internet, and they were never meant for anyone outside the company to read. These were not press releases. These were not talking points polished by a communications team. These were raw internal strategy memos written by Microsoft's own engineers and executives, assessing the rising threat of Linux and the open source movement with a level of honesty companies almost never allow the public to see. Buried inside those documents was a phrase that would go on to define an entire era of corporate strategy. Embrace, extend, extinguish. Adopt the language of the thing threatening you. Integrate with it so deeply that people become dependent on your version of it. And then, once that dependency is locked in, quietly make the original irrelevant. Around that same moment, Microsoft's CEO stood in front of reporters and called Linux a cancer, an intellectual property cancer that attached itself to everything it touched. That was not an off-the-cuff jab. That was a calculated message sent to enterprise customers. Microsoft was actively trying to scare away from open source. And when a young, blunt, uncompromising kernel developer named Linus Torvalds responded, he did not just defend his operating system. He said something bigger. He said any company promising you openness while trying to convert control was a company that would eventually make you regret trusting it, because the fundamental nature of a corporation is to maximize control over its environment, always, no matter what the marketing says this year. The press had a script ready for that response, and they used it immediately. Linus was framed as the difficult personality, the idealist who could not accept commercial reality, the man still fighting a war that had already ended. Microsoft, meanwhile, got to play the reasonable adult in the room. That framing was comfortable. It was clean. It made for an easy narrative. And it was almost completely wrong, which is the part nobody wants to sit with, because admitting Linus was right means admitting an entire industry of journalists, analysts, and developers spent 2 decades being persuaded by a rebrand instead of a transformation. Because here is what nobody wants to say out loud. The rehabilitation of Microsoft's image did not happen by accident. It began the exact moment a new CEO walked through the door in February of 2014 with a softer tone, warmer language, and a genuine willingness to make real technical contributions to the very community his predecessor had called a cancer. And to be fair, some of it was real. Microsoft open-sourced parts of its development framework. It built one of the most beloved code editors in the world, a tool that developers everywhere now use daily without a second thought about who made it. It built a way to run Linux directly inside Windows, solving a real practical problem for millions of engineers. These were not hollow gestures. They were genuinely useful. But here's the question almost nobody asked while they were busy praising the new, friendlier Microsoft. What was all of that goodwill actually building toward? Linus never said Microsoft was incapable of doing good work. That was never his argument, and it is important you understand that, because it is the exact argument the press pretended he was making, so they could dismiss him more easily. His actual argument was structural. Once a company accumulates enough control over the infrastructure everyone depends on, the good work stops being the point, because the good work was never the destination. It was the on-ramp. And if you trace the timeline honestly from that moment forward to right now, The pattern he described plays out with an accuracy that should genuinely unsettle you. Now let's talk about the moment the pivot became visible. Because there's a very specific point where this stopped being theory and became something you could watch happen in real time. There is a single image that captures just how dramatic this rehabilitation looked from the outside, because at a major developer conference not long after the new CEO took over, a slide appeared on stage reading, in plain black text, that Microsoft loves Linux, and the room reportedly erupted, developers who had spent a decade treating that company as an adversary suddenly applauding a company, publicly declaring love for the very thing it had once called a cancer. Podcasts dissected the moment. Blog posts were written celebrating how far the industry had come. Conference keynotes leaned into the new tone year after year, each one adding another data point to the story that this was a genuinely transformed institution, not a rebranded one. And it is worth being honest about how effective that emotional arcus actually was, because trust is not rebuilt through spreadsheets and press releases. It is rebuilt through moments like that one, moments engineered to feel human, to feel like a real change of heart rather than a change of strategy. Millions of developers who had grown up resenting this company found themselves genuinely rooting for it, genuinely defending it. In comment sections and forums against critics who sounded, it was better than the unencrypted nightmare it started as. It was still, by the assessment of the people whose entire job is finding these flaws, a comprehensive surveillance system running quietly on millions of machines around the world. And I want to be fair here, because the honest and slightly more unsettling explanation is not that some shadowy team sat in a room plotting to surveil you. It's more mundane than that, and in some ways that makes it worse. Individual teams build features they genuinely believe will be useful. Individual executives greenlight decisions they genuinely believe serve legitimate business goals. Nobody needs a secret meeting to arrive at a pattern like this. The pattern emerges naturally, predictably, almost mechanically, from a set of incentives that reward platform control, data collection, and ecosystem lock in far more than they reward user autonomy or restraint. Linus did not know this because he had access to some secret internal memo nobody else could see. He knew it because he understood, at a level, most people never bother to think through exactly how incentive structures inside large corporations actually behave over long periods of time, and because he had personally watched Microsoft operate under those same incentives for 3 straight decades. By late 2024, something started shifting in the way developers talked about all of this in public, something that had not really existed during the years everyone was busy celebrating the new, friendlier Microsoft. People who had spent a decade writing thoughtful essays about how much the company had genuinely changed started asking sharper, less comfortable questions instead. Why does data collection remain effectively mandatory, even for professionals who explicitly tried to switch it off? Why do your own app preferences keep quietly resetting back toward Microsoft's products after every single update? Why do features that used to run privately, locally, on your own device, now suddenly require an account and a cloud connection to function at all? Why? Does the company controlling the world's largest hub of open source code keep using that code to train proprietary products without any real consent from the people who wrote it? None of these questions have comfortable answers for a company that spent an entire decade building a reputation on exactly the opposite promise. And the fact that serious, credible voices in the developer community were asking them with this much frequency by 2025 tells you the mood had shifted in a way most of the mainstream press still had not caught up with. Fast forward to the OpenAI relationship, because this is the piece that turns an old developer grudge into something that touches almost every single person reading this right now, whether they have ever typed a line of code in their life or not. Microsoft poured roughly $13 billion into OpenAI according to public financial disclosures, and in exchange, it did not just become an investor sitting quietly on the sidelines, it became the exclusive infrastructure provider, running the models underneath the products, which meant Microsoft now sat at the center of the single fastest growing technology shift in a generation, with the ability to embed that intelligence directly into the operating system running on more than 1 billion computers worldwide, into the Office suite handling the private documents of governments and corporations, into the browser tracking what people search for, and into the development platform hosting the code powering half the internet. Every one of those integrations quietly asked for something. The old Microsoft could only have dreamed of collecting at this scale. Your documents, your unfinished emails, your private codebase, your search history, your daily communication patterns, all of it flowing continuously through infrastructure, owned, operated, and governed entirely on Microsoft's own terms. And this is precisely the part that should stop you cold, because it is not hypothetical anymore. In interviews and public statements reported across technology publications in the years following the AI boom, Linus continued voicing the same structural skepticism he had voiced since 2001, this time aimed specifically at how deeply these new AI systems were being granted access at the operating system's kernel level, the deepest, most privileged layer of the entire machine, the layer that controls everything else running on top of it. He was not raising alarms about a specific feature or a specific product name. He was raising the same alarm he had always raised, translated into the language of a new era. Once you let a corporation's AI sit at the very core of the machine you depend on every day, you have handed over a form of control that is almost impossible to meaningfully take back, no matter how many settings toggles they eventually let you switch off. What makes this whole story land so hard is not any single decision in isolation. It is the sheer consistency of the pattern across a timeline, stretching back further than most of the people reading this have been using computers at all. A courtroom antitrust ruling in the 1990s over a bundled browser, a leaked internal memo in 2001 describing a strategy to embrace, extend, and extinguish an entire open movement, a public insult calling that same movement a cancer, a decade of genuine, carefully curated goodwill-building trust back up from zero, an acquisition of the very infrastructure that movement depended on, accompanied by a promise of independence, a proprietary AI product trained on that community's own labor without meaningful consent, an operating system update cycle that steadily closed every door marked opt-out, a flagship AI feature that turned out to be quietly, logging a searchable record of a person's entire digital life, protected by nothing stronger than the same 4-digit code people use to unlock a vending machine payment app. And now, sitting on top of all of it, a $13 billion stake in the company defining the next decade of artificial intelligence, wired directly into the operating system, the Office suite, the browser, and the code repository that together touch nearly every working professional on the planet in one form or another. None of this required a villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom somewhere. That is honestly the part that should unsettle you more than any conspiracy theory ever could. It required nothing except ordinary corporate incentives being followed quarter after quarter, year after year, decade after decade, by thousands of individually reasonable people making individually reasonable decisions inside a structure that consistently rewards control over restraint. Linus did not need inside information to predict where that structure would end up. He needed only to understand, with unusual clarity, that incentives shape outcomes far more reliably than intentions ever do, and that a corporation's stated values matter far less over a long enough timeline than the structure of what it is actually rewarded for building. So here is where all of this actually lands, because the interesting question was never really whether Linus turns out to have been right. That question has already been answered, documented across a quarter-century of leaked memos, lawsuits, security research, and product decisions that speak for themselves far louder than any keynote ever could. The real question, the one that actually matters to you sitting there right now, is what you do with that information. Do you keep making decisions about the software running your entire digital life based on the comfortable assumption that the company controlling your operating system, or your development tools, your productivity software, and increasingly the AI layer sitting on top of all of it, has interests that line up neatly with yours? Or do you start making those decisions based on what 25 years of actual documented behavior tells you? You about where this is heading, and more importantly, who it is actually built to serve. Linus Torvalds built an entire operating system, one still running on more devices worldwide than almost anything else in existence, because he believed the people using software should be the ones controlling it, not the other way around. That principle has not aged one single day. If anything, it has gotten sharper, more urgent, more relevant with every new architectural decision made since 2020, and with every single AI integration that quietly pulls one more layer of your digital life out of your own hands and into someone else's infrastructure. He was right in 2001. He was right in 2014. He was right about the acquisition everyone celebrated. He was right about the telemetry nobody could fully switch off. He was right about the lock disguised as convenience. And the people who spent 2 decades calling him paranoid have gotten very, very quiet about it lately. And maybe the most uncomfortable part of this entire story is realizing that the next version of this pattern is probably unfolding again right now, in some product meeting, in some roadmap nobody outside the company has seen, dressed in language about convenience and intelligence, waiting for its own future moment of disclosure years down the road. When someone finally asks the same simple question Linus asked back in 2001, who does this actually serve and who quietly pays the price? At the time, like they simply hadn't gotten the memo that things were different now. That emotional investment matters enormously to this story because the harder a community falls in love with a narrative of redemption, the harder it becomes to notice the moment that redemption quietly starts serving a different purpose than the one everyone assumed. Nobody wants to be the person who cheered too early. Nobody wants to admit the goodwill they defended for a decade was, at best, a genuine but temporary alignment of interests, rather than a permanent change in what the company fundamentally optimizes for. And that reluctance, and that very human reluctance to re-examine a story you have already told yourself and told your friends and told strangers online, is exactly the space in which a pattern like this one is allowed to keep repeating quietly for years before enough people are willing to say what they are actually seeing. In 2018, Microsoft bought the platform hosting the overwhelming majority of the world's open source code for $7.5 billion. The reaction split instantly. Some developers were cautiously optimistic, pointing to Microsoft's recent good behavior as proof this would be different. Others, Linus among them, pointed out something structurally undeniable. The largest proprietary software company on the planet now owned the pipes through which almost all open collaborative software flowed. Microsoft's promise was explicit. The platform would remain independent. Nothing would change. For about 3 years, that promise appeared to hold, and then it didn't. In 2021, Microsoft launched an AI coding assistant trained on billions of lines of code sitting on that very platform. Code uploaded by developers under open licenses that were written decades earlier by people who never imagined their work would one day become raw training material for a subscription product they would never see a cent from and never explicitly agreed to feed. The legal fallout was immediate. A software freedom advocacy group published an analysis arguing the whole arrangement created serious license compliance problems Microsoft had simply chosen not to solve before shipping. A class action lawsuit followed within the year, alleging exactly what it looked like from the outside, that years of community labor had been quietly repurposed into a proprietary revenue engine with no attribution, no compensation, and no opt-out for the people whose work made it possible in the first place. Sit with that for a second, because this is the part that should genuinely bother you regardless of how you feel about Microsoft as a brand. An entire community spent years building something collectively, in good faith, under licenses meant to protect that openness. A single company acquired the infrastructure hosting that shared resource, while publicly promising independence. And then that same company used the data sitting inside that infrastructure to build a commercial product that generates revenue exclusively for itself. This was not an accident buried in some rogue engineering team's decision. This was a strategic call made at the highest levels of one of the most sophisticated corporations on Earth, and it maps almost perfectly onto the exact pattern Linus described 2 decades earlier, using words nobody wanted to believe applied anymore. Now here is where the story gets personal, because this is not just about developer licenses and open source politics anymore. This is about the machine sitting on your desk or in your bag right now. When the newest version of Windows launched in the fall of 2021, it arrived with requirements that quietly reshaped what it even meant to own a Windows computer. Setting it up now required linking a Microsoft account, a requirement you could dodge with clever workarounds for a while. Workarounds Microsoft has been steadily closing off update after update ever since. Data collection that used to be at least partially optional became, for all practical purposes, mandatory, even for professional and enterprise users who explicitly tried to turn it off. Settings that once let you fully disable certain telemetry quietly vanished. The built-in browser kept reinstalling itself no matter how many times people removed it. Default app choices kept resetting themselves after updates, always back toward Microsoft's own products. Individually, every single one of these decisions has a plausible, defensible, boring corporate explanation. But stacked together across 4 straight years of updates, they describe exactly the shift Linus warned about. A platform that keeps the surface appearance of user choice, while the actual control keeps sliding quietly back toward the company that built it. And then came the moment where all of that architectural pressure finally broke into the open in a way nobody could look away from. In May of 2024, Microsoft unveiled a flagship feature for its newest premium hardware line, and the pitch sounded almost magical. Your computer would take a screenshot every few seconds, silently, constantly, running text recognition locally, so it could build a fully searchable timeline of literally everything you had ever done on your machine. Lost a document from last Thursday? Just ask. Trying to recall one specific paragraph from a website you glanced at 3 weeks ago? Just ask. It was marketed as nothing less than giving your operating system a photographic memory. What the glossy keynote conveniently left out were the technical details independent security researchers uncovered within days of the announcement. A former Microsoft threat intelligence analyst found that this feature was storing its entire rolling history of your digital life in an unencrypted database sitting quietly in your own user folder, accessible to any ordinary application, running with completely standard permissions, no special access required. Another researcher built a tool that could rip months of that history out in under 2 minutes. Passwords, typed in plain text, financial records, private messages already decrypted and sitting there in the open, active login tokens ready to be hijacked. And the terrifying part is how low the bar was to get to all of it. No advanced hacking, no administrator privileges, just run one file on the machine. An access-level ordinary malware achieves constantly through a single careless click on a phishing email or a shady download. Regulators noticed almost immediately. Privacy researchers called it an unprecedented expansion of what a piece of malware sitting on your machine could actually reach. Security professionals said, bluntly, that this built-in feature behaved functionally identically to the kind of surveillance spyware that corporate security teams spend millions of dollars every year trying to detect and remove from their networks. And here is where the pattern Linus described plays out one more time, beat for beat. Microsoft delayed the public release. It pulled the feature back into limited preview. Channels. It eventually shipped a redesigned version and framed the entire saga as proof the company listens, proof it takes privacy seriously, proof this is exactly the kind of responsible iteration a mature company performs. And in the narrow technical sense, some of those fixes were genuinely real. But when independent researchers tested the supposedly fixed version months later, the database could still be unlocked with nothing more than the same 4 to 6 digit PIN code millions of people have been typing to unlock their phone for a decade. One researcher demonstrated publicly that a person with zero technical skill could unlock his entire digital history just by knowing that PIN. The filters meant to scrub sensitive financial and personal data kept failing in exactly the ways they weren't supposed to.